The autumn wind howled through the towering pines surrounding Sarah McKenna's remote cabin, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of winter's early arrival. At 28, Sarah had grown accustomed to the isolation of her mountain homestead in the Colorado Territory, but tonight felt different, heavier somehow, as if the very air held secrets waiting to unfold. She was splitting kindling by lamplight on her covered porch when she heard it, a low, pained groan echoing from the tree line beyond her garden. Sarah's weathered hands tightened around the axe handle as she peered into the darkness. Living alone in these mountains had taught her to trust her instincts, and every fiber of her being screamed danger. "Hello?" she called out, her voice steady, despite the rapid beating of her heart. "Who's out there?" Silence answered her, broken only by the whisper of wind through pine needles. Sarah waited, counting her heartbeats, before setting down the axe and retrieving the Winchester rifle from beside her door. She'd learned to shoot when her husband James died 3 years ago, leaving her to defend the homestead alone. The groan came again, weaker this time, from near the old oak tree where she'd hung James's swing. Sarah moved carefully across the moonlit yard, her boots crunching softly on fallen leaves. The rifle felt familiar in her hands now, though she prayed she wouldn't need to use it. What she found beneath the oak tree changed everything. A man lay crumpled against the massive trunk, his breathing shallow and labored. Even in the dim moonlight, Sarah could see the dark stain spreading across his chest, blood fresh and still flowing. His long black hair was matted with dirt and sweat, and traditional Apache clothing marked him as one of the tribal warriors she'd heard about in town. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The tensions between the settlers and Apache had reached a boiling point in recent months. Just last week, she'd overheard angry conversations at Morrison's general store about raids and retaliations. Captain Morrison's cavalry unit had been scouring the territory, hunting what they called hostiles with a vengeance that made even hardened frontiersmen uncomfortable. The wounded man's eyes fluttered open, dark and filled with pain but alert. He tried to push himself upright but collapsed back against the tree with a suppressed cry. His gaze found Sarah's face, and she saw something there that struck her to the core. Not the savage menace she'd been told to expect, but desperate human suffering. "Please," he whispered in English, his voice barely audible. "Help. Me." Sarah's mind raced. Every rational thought told her to leave him there, to ride to town for the sheriff. This was exactly the kind of situation her neighbors had warned her about. But looking at this dying man, she saw only another human being in desperate need. "Can you walk?" she asked quietly, moving closer despite every instinct screaming at her to run. The warrior shook his head slightly. "Shot in chest. Lost much blood." Sarah glanced toward the trail leading down the mountain. She knew that whoever had shot this man couldn't be far behind. If she helped him, she'd be putting herself in terrible danger. If she didn't, he would surely die before morning. The choice, when it came, surprised her with its clarity. "I'm going to help you to my cabin," she said firmly. "Can you put your arm around my shoulder?" The warrior's eyes widened with something that might have been surprise or gratitude. "Why?" he managed to ask. Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Because it's the right thing to do." Getting him inside proved nearly impossible. Despite being lean and wiry, the warrior was dead weight, and Sarah had to use every ounce of strength she possessed to half carry, half drag him up the porch steps and through her front door. By the time she settled him on her kitchen table, both of them were breathing hard. In the lamplight, she could see the full extent of his injuries. The bullet had entered his chest just below his left shoulder, and blood seeped steadily through the makeshift bandage of torn cloth he'd pressed against the wound. His face was pale beneath his bronze skin, and his breathing came in short, painful gasps. "I'm going to have to clean this wound," Sarah said, already moving to gather her medical supplies. Living alone had taught her basic doctoring out of necessity. "It's going to hurt," the warrior nodded, his jaw set with determination. "My name is Ayanna. It means eternal blossom." Sarah paused in her preparations. She'd expected a harsh, Foreign name, not something so unexpectedly poetic. I'm Sarah McKenna, and you're bleeding all over my good tablecloth. Despite his pain, Ayana's lips curved in what might have been a smile. Sorry for the, inconvenience. As Sarah worked to clean and bandage the wound, she found herself talking, partly to distract him from the pain, partly to calm her own nerves. She told him about her life on the mountain, about James and how he'd built this cabin with his own hands, about the harsh winters and the sweet springs that followed. Ayana listened, occasionally asking quiet questions about her life. His English was better than she'd expected, and she learned that he'd been educated by missionaries as a child before returning to his people. There was an intelligence in his dark eyes that challenged every stereotype she'd carried about his people. "Why did you come back?" she asked as she secured the last of the bandages. "To the Apache, I mean. If you had education, opportunities." Ayana was quiet for a long moment. "Because they are my people," he said finally. "Because someone must stand between them and those who would destroy us completely." The simple dignity in his words made Sarah's chest tighten. She'd grown up hearing stories about savage Indians, but the man on her table spoke of protection and loyalty, values she understood completely. As she worked, Sarah became aware of sounds in the distance. Horses moving through the forest, men calling to each other. The posse was getting closer. "They're coming for you," she said quietly. Ayana nodded grimly. "Captain Morrison. He does not take prisoners." Sarah had heard the stories about Morrison's methods, how suspects often died, trying to escape, how Apache camps were burned without regard for women and children. The thought made her stomach turn. "Can you ride?" she asked. "If I must." Sarah made her decision quickly. She couldn't let them take Ayana, not when she'd seen the humanity in his eyes, heard the intelligence in his voice. Whatever he'd done, to earn Morrison's wrath, he deserved better than a rope or a bullet in the back. "My husband's horse is in the barn," she said. "Storm. He's a good mountain horse, sure-footed. Take him and ride north toward Eagle's Peak. There's a hidden trail that leads to the high country where they won't be able to follow with a large group." Ayana struggled to sit up, his eyes searching her face. "Why are you doing this? Your people will not understand." Sarah helped him to his feet, steadying him when he swayed. "My people don't get to decide what's right for me." The sound of approaching horses grew louder. Sarah quickly gathered supplies: jerky, hardtack, a water skin, and a heavy coat that had belonged to James. She pressed them into Ayana's hands along with a small pouch of silver coins. "This should get you somewhere safe," she said. At the barn, Storm snorted nervously as Sarah saddled him in the darkness. The big bay stallion had been James's pride, and Sarah rarely rode him anymore. Tonight, he seemed to sense the urgency in the air. Ayana mounted with difficulty, his face tight with pain but his jaw set with determination. From horseback, he looked every inch the warrior she'd been taught to fear, but Sarah saw only the man she'd just saved. "I will not forget this," he said quietly. "If you are ever in danger because of what you have done tonight, just ride," Sarah interrupted, "and stay alive. That's payment enough." Ayana wheeled Storm toward the back trail, then turned back once more. "Sarah McKenna," he said formally, "you have shown me that honor exists in all peoples. I pray we meet again under better circumstances." Then he was gone, disappearing into the forest shadows like a ghost. Sarah watched until she could no longer hear Storm's hoofbeats, then hurried back to her cabin to clean away any evidence of what had transpired. She scrubbed the blood from her kitchen table, burned the bloody rags, and arranged the furniture to hide any signs of disturbance. But even as she worked, Sarah knew it might not be enough. Morrison was said to be as cunning as he was ruthless, and if he suspected she'd helped his quarry escape. The sound of approaching horses reached her ears just as she finished. Sarah quickly changed into her nightgown and braided her long auburn hair, trying to look as though she'd been awakened from sleep. She had just settled into her rocking chair with a cup of cold coffee when the thundering of hooves filled her yard. Through her window, Sarah counted the flickering torches of at least a dozen riders. Her heart hammered against her ribs as heavy boots stomped across her porch, but she forced herself to remain still. Whatever came next, she'd made her choice. Now she had to live with the consequences. Sarah's eyes snapped open to the thunder of hoofbeats surrounding her cabin. Gray dawn light filtered through her bedroom window, and for a heart-stopping moment, she hoped the sounds were part of a nightmare. Then a voice boomed across her yard, dispelling any hope of peaceful awakening. "Sarah McKenna, come out with your hands visible." She rolled out of bed, her bare feet hitting the cold wooden floor as she rushed to the window. What she saw made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. Riders formed a complete circle around her homestead. Not the dozen she'd counted in the darkness, but nearly 40 mounted men. Cavalry soldiers in dusty blue uniforms sat beside grizzled bounty hunters in leather and denim. Townsmen she recognized, from Morrison's general store, gripped rifles with white-knuckled determination. At the center of the formation sat Captain Morrison himself, a man whose reputation preceded him like smoke from a wildfire. Tall and rail-thin, with steel-gray hair and pale eyes that seemed to look right through a person, he commanded attention without saying a word. His uniform was immaculate despite the hard ride, and the saber at his side caught the early morning light. "Mrs. McKenna," Morrison called again, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "I know you're awake. We need to have a conversation." Sarah's hands trembled as she pulled on her heaviest dress, a practical brown wool that had belonged to her mother. She braided her hair quickly, trying to buy time to think. Every minute she delayed was another minute for Ayanna to put distance between himself and his pursuers. She opened her front door slowly, keeping her hands visible as instructed. The circle of men tightened almost imperceptibly, and she felt 40 pairs of eyes studying her every movement. The morning air was crisp and sharp, carrying the scent of horses, leather, and gun oil. "Captain Morrison," she said with forced calmness, stepping onto her porch, "you're up early, and you've brought quite a crowd." Morrison dismounted with fluid grace, his boots hitting the ground with authority. Up close, Sarah could see the intelligence in his pale eyes, and something else that made her skin crawl. This was a man who enjoyed his work far too much. "We're tracking a dangerous Apache warrior," Morrison said without preamble. "His trail leads directly to your property. We have reason to believe he may have threatened or coerced you into providing assistance." Sarah raised an eyebrow, grateful for the steadying presence of her porch railing beneath her hands. "I haven't seen any Apache warriors, Captain. I was splitting kindling last evening, had my supper, and went to bed early, just like every other night." "Is that so?" Morrison's voice carried a note of skeptical amusement. He gestured to one of his men, a tracker wearing buckskins and a battered hat. "Jake here is the finest tracker in the territory. He says the trail stops at your front door." The tracker, a lean man with sharp features and intelligent eyes, dismounted and approached the cabin. Sarah watched nervously as he studied the ground around her porch, following invisible signs that meant nothing to her but apparently told him volumes. "Blood drops here," Jake announced, pointing to spots on her porch that Sarah couldn't see. "And here, someone wounded was definitely here last night." He moved toward her garden, then stopped beside the old oak tree. "This is where he fell first. Lost a good amount of blood." Sarah's heart pounded, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "I heard some kind of animal last night. Could have been a wounded deer. Mountain lions have been hunting close to the homesteads lately." Morrison's smile was thin and cold. "A wounded deer that bleeds in a straight line to your front door? Mrs. McKenna, I think you're not being entirely truthful with me." The circle of riders shifted restlessly, hands moving to weapons. Sarah realized with growing alarm that this wasn't just an interrogation, it was a siege. These men had surrounded her completely, cutting off any chance of escape. "I'm telling you the truth," Sarah insisted. "I live alone up here, Captain. If I'd seen a dangerous warrior, don't you think I would have ridden straight to town for help?" "That's exactly what a sensible woman would do," Morrison agreed, walking closer to the porch. "But you're not just any woman, are you, Mrs. McKenna? You're the widow who refused to sell her property when the Apache raids started. The woman who insists on living alone in these mountains despite repeated warnings. Sarah lifted her chin, defiantly. This is my home. My husband built it with his own hands. I won't be driven away by fear. Fear keeps people alive out here, Morrison said sharply, and sometimes compassion gets them killed. He studied her face intently. The warrior we're tracking goes by the name Ayanna. He's wanted for the murder of 3 soldiers and the theft of army weapons. He's considered extremely dangerous. The accusation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Murder? The man she'd helped had seemed intelligent, even gentle despite his obvious pain. Could she have been so wrong about his character? Morrison apparently saw something in her expression because his smile widened. Ah, now we're getting somewhere. You have seen him, haven't you? Sarah fought to keep her voice level. I told you I haven't seen any warriors. If this Ayanna is as dangerous as you say, shouldn't you be out tracking him instead of harassing law-abiding citizens? The trail ends here, Morrison said flatly. Jake's never been wrong about a trail yet. So either this warrior vanished into thin air, or someone helped him continue on his way. The captain walked around Sarah's porch slowly, his pale eyes taking in every detail. He paused at her woodpile, studying the scattered kindling she'd abandoned when she heard Ayanna's first groan. Then he moved to her small barn, peering inside at the empty stall where Storm usually stood. Where's your horse, Mrs. McKenna? Sarah's mouth went dry. She hadn't thought about Storm's absence, a critical oversight that could cost her everything. I turned him out to graze in the high meadow yesterday. Sometimes I leave him up there for days at a time. Is that so? Morrison's voice carried a dangerous edge. Jake, what do you make of these tracks leading from the barn? The tracker knelt beside the barn door, studying the ground with professional intensity. 2 sets of tracks leaving the barn last night, he announced. One set belongs to a mountain horse, big heavy shoes. The other set... He paused, looking up at Morrison. Moccasins, someone on foot leading the horse. The circle of riders tightened, and Sarah heard the distinctive sound of rifles being cocked. Her breath came in short gasps as she realized how completely trapped she was. Last chance, Mrs. McKenna, Morrison said quietly, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm. Tell me where Ayanna went, and we'll consider that you were coerced into helping him. Lie to me again, and I'll assume you're a willing collaborator with a known murderer. Sarah's mind raced frantically. She could feel the weight of 40 stairs, the tension in the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. These men were ready for violence. Some of them seemed eager for it. But even facing this overwhelming force, Sarah couldn't bring herself to betray the wounded man she'd helped. There had been something in Ayanna's eyes, something that contradicted everything Morrison claimed about him. If he truly was a murderer, why had he asked for help so gently? Why had he shown such concern for her safety? I can't tell you what I don't know, Sarah said firmly. I haven't seen this warrior you're looking for. Morrison's expression hardened into something truly frightening. Then I'm afraid we have a problem, Mrs. McKenna, because I don't believe. You and my men have ridden hard all night tracking a killer. They're tired, angry, and looking for justice. The sun blazed mercilessly overhead as the standoff entered its 3rd hour. Sarah's throat was parched, and sweat trickled down her back, beneath the heavy wool dress, but she refused to show any sign of weakness. Captain Morrison had positioned himself in the shade of her porch while she stood exposed in the yard, a deliberate psychological tactic that wasn't lost on her. You know, Mrs. McKenna, Morrison said conversationally, I've been thinking about your situation up here. A woman alone, no neighbors for miles, winter coming on fast, it must get lonely. Sarah said nothing, though every instinct screamed at her to defend herself against the implication in his tone. Morrison continued, his voice taking on a false sympathy that made her skin crawl. Loneliness can make people do foolish things, make them trust the wrong people, maybe even develop inappropriate feelings for them. A rumble of ugly laughter rippled through his men. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her chin raised defiantly. That's a disgusting suggestion, Captain, she said evenly, even for a man of your reputation. Morrison's pale eyes flashed dangerously. My reputation? What exactly? Have you heard about my reputation, Mrs. McKenna? Sarah realized she'd made a tactical error, but it was too late to retreat. I've heard that you don't take prisoners, she said quietly, that Apache families disappear without a trace after your visits to their camps. The captain's smile was cold as winter wind. I follow orders, ma'am. Nothing more, nothing less. The army wants this territory pacified, and I deliver results. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. But sometimes I have to make difficult decisions about who can be trusted to keep the peace. The threat was unmistakable. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Morrison wasn't just hunting Ayanna. He was evaluating whether she posed a threat to his mission. Jake, Morrison called to his tracker. Come here and tell Mrs. McKenna what else you found. The lean tracker approached with obvious reluctance. Unlike many of Morrison's men, he seemed uncomfortable with the captain's methods. Ma'am, he said respectfully, I found something else you should know about. He led Sarah and Morrison to the edge of her vegetable garden, where he pointed to barely visible depressions in the soft earth. 2 sets of footprints here. One belongs to a woman, about your size, ma'am. The other's from moccasins, size and shape consistent with our quarry. Sarah's heart sank. She'd been so focused on hiding the blood evidence that she'd forgotten about the tracks they'd left walking to and from the barn. These prints tell a story, Jake continued, his weathered face troubled. The woman's walking alongside the man, not being forced. They're moving slow, like she's helping support his weight. This wasn't a hostage situation, Captain. This was willing assistance. Morrison's triumphant smile made Sarah's stomach clench with dread. Well, well, it seems we have our answer at last. He raised his voice so all his men could hear. Mrs. Sarah McKenna willingly aided and abetted a wanted murderer. She helped him escape justice. Angry voices rose from the circle of riders. Sarah heard words that made her flinch. Traitor. Indian lover. Ought to be strung up. The mob mentality was taking hold, and she could see Morrison encouraging it with subtle nods and meaningful looks. String her up. Burn the cabin. Make her tell us where he went. Morrison raised his hand for silence, but his eyes glittered with satisfaction. Now, gentlemen, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Mrs. McKenna still has a chance to cooperate. He turned to Sarah with mock politeness. Ma'am, in light of this new evidence, I'm prepared to offer you a deal. Tell us which direction the Apache went, and I'll make sure you're treated fairly when we get back to town. Sarah looked around the circle of hostile faces and realized how naive she'd been. These men had already decided her guilt. The only question now was whether they'd let her live long enough to face a territorial judge, assuming Morrison intended to let the law handle her at all. And if I refuse? She asked quietly. Morrison's smile was razor thin. Well, ma'am, we're a long way from town. Long way from witnesses. Sometimes unfortunate things happen during the pursuit of dangerous fugitives. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Sarah understood now that she was facing men who saw her as something less than human, a traitor who'd forfeited any right to justice or mercy. But even facing death, she couldn't bring herself to betray Ayanna. The memory of his eyes, the quiet dignity in his voice, the way he'd thanked her for showing him that honor existed in all peoples, these things mattered more than her own safety. I have nothing more to say, Sarah said firmly. Morrison's expression darkened. Boys, I think Mrs. McKenna needs some encouragement to remember her civic duties. Several riders dismounted, advancing toward Sarah with obvious intent. She backed toward her cabin, but there was nowhere to run. The circle was complete and she was vastly outnumbered. Then something unexpected happened. Jake the tracker stepped between Sarah and Morrison's advancing men. Captain, he said quietly, this ain't right. She's one woman alone. Whatever she done, she deserves a fair trial. Morrison's voice went deadly quiet. Are you questioning my methods, Jake? The tracker's jaw tightened, but he didn't back down. I'm saying there's a right way and a wrong way to handle this. We're supposed to be better than the savages we're fighting. Morrison seemed to sense the shift in mood among his troops. His pale eyes swept the circle, noting which men looked uncertain, which ones avoided his gaze. Political calculation flickered across his features. "Very well," he said at last. "We'll do this by the book. Mrs. McKenna, you're under arrest for aiding and abetting a fugitive from justice." Relief flooded through Sarah, though she knew her situation was still desperate. At least she'd live to see another day, and perhaps in town she'd find people willing to listen to reason. But Morrison wasn't finished. "Of course," he continued, "we still need to track down this Apache murderer. Since Mrs. McKenna won't cooperate, we'll have to try a different approach." He gestured to several of his most ruthless-looking men. "Burn her cabin and barn, salt the garden. If she wants to help murderers, she can live with the consequences." "No," Sarah cried, lunging forward. "Please, this is my home." Strong hands seized her arms, holding her back as Morrison's men began gathering kindling and lamp oil. Sarah watched in horror as they prepared to destroy everything James had built, everything that connected her to her life before this nightmare began. "Stop this," Jake protested. "Destroying her property won't help us catch the Apache." Morrison rounded on the tracker with barely contained fury. "The Apache is probably watching from the ridgeline right now. When he sees what happens to people who help him, maybe he'll think twice about putting other innocents at risk." Sarah's heart lurched as she realized Morrison's true strategy. He was using her as bait, destroying her life to draw Ayanna into a trap. The captain was gambling that the warrior's conscience wouldn't let him watch an innocent woman suffer for helping him. "You're counting on him coming back," Sarah said with sudden understanding. "You want him to see what you're doing to me?" Morrison's smile was coldly satisfied. "A man with a conscience is predictable, Mrs. McKenna. And from what I've heard about this particular Apache, he has more conscience than is good for him." The first flames licked at Sarah's garden fence as Morrison's men set their torches to her property. Smoke began to rise into the clear mountain air, a signal that could be seen for miles. Sarah closed her eyes, praying that Ayanna was far away by now, safely beyond the reach of Morrison's trap. But even as she prayed, she feared that the warrior's sense of honor might prove to be both their downfall. The acrid smell of smoke stung Sarah's eyes as flames consumed her vegetable garden and began licking at the walls of her barn. Morrison's men worked with methodical efficiency, setting fires that would reduce her homestead to ash and memory. Through the chaos, she caught glimpses of the captain watching the ridgeline with predatory intensity, waiting for his trap to spring. "Please," Sarah begged, though she knew it was futile. "At least let me get some of my belongings. My husband's Bible. My mother's photograph." Morrison didn't even look at her. "Murderers' accomplices don't get to make requests," he said coldly. His pale eyes never left the mountain peaks surrounding them. "He's up there somewhere, I can feel it." Sarah's heart broke as flames reached her cabin's front porch, the same porch where she'd split kindling just hours before her life changed, forever. The rocking chair James had carved for their first anniversary collapsed into burning splinters. Then, through the smoke and crackling flames, she heard it, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats from the high trail. Morrison's head snapped toward the sound, his hand dropping to his sidearm. "There!" he shouted to his men. "Form up, he's coming down the north trail." But instead of the single rider Morrison expected, a line of mounted figures emerged from the tree line. Sarah's breath caught as she counted them. At least 20 Apache warriors, riding in perfect formation with Ayanna at their head. He sat tall in Storm's saddle, no longer the wounded man she'd helped escape. War paint streaked his face and traditional weapons gleamed in the morning sun. Morrison's confident expression faltered as he realized he was no longer the hunter but the hunted. His 40 men suddenly didn't seem like such overwhelming odds against Apache warriors fighting on their own territory. "Form a defensive circle," Morrison barked. "Prepare to repel attack." But Ayanna raised his hand and his warriors halted just beyond rifle range. The Apache leader rode forward alone, stopping halfway between the two forces. His voice carried clearly across the smoking yard. "Captain Morrison," he called. "I have come to make a trade. Morrison spurred his horse forward to meet Ayanna, keeping his rifle ready. "You're in no position to negotiate, Apache. You're surrounded and outnumbered." Ayanna's smile was grim. "Am I? Look around you, Captain. Count the warriors on the ridges." For the first time, Morrison's confidence cracked. Sarah followed his gaze and gasped as she saw the truth. More Apache fighters had appeared along the high peaks, their silhouettes clearly visible against the sky. Morrison's force wasn't surrounding anyone. They were trapped in the valley with no escape route. "What do you want?" Morrison demanded, though his voice had lost its commanding edge. "The woman," Ayanna said simply. "She showed me mercy when she could have let me die. She has paid enough for that kindness." Morrison's laugh was harsh and desperate. "You think I'll trade a murderer for one white woman? She's a traitor who chose your kind over her own people." "She chose humanity over hatred," Ayanna replied. "Something you would never understand." Sarah watched this exchange with growing dread. She could see Morrison calculating odds, studying escape routes, his pale eyes growing more dangerous by the moment. This was a man who'd built his reputation on never backing down, never showing weakness. "I'll make you a counteroffer," Morrison said with false bravado. "Surrender yourself and I'll let your warriors leave peacefully. Refuse and I'll make sure the woman burns with her cabin." To emphasize his point, Morrison gestured to his men. Several soldiers grabbed burning brands from the fires and moved toward Sarah. Ayanna's expression grew deadly still. "You would murder an innocent woman to satisfy your bloodlust." "I would execute a traitor to protect civilized society," Morrison replied. "The choice is yours, Apache." Sarah saw Ayanna's internal struggle, the same impossible choice she'd faced the night before. But she had learned something about courage in the past 24 hours. "Don't," she called out to Ayanna. "Don't let him use me against you. Whatever you've done, whatever you're accused of, don't give up your life for mine." Morrison backhanded her viciously, sending her sprawling in the dirt. "Shut your mouth, traitor." That single act of brutality changed everything. Ayanna's war cry split the mountain air like a thunderbolt, and suddenly the valley erupted into chaos. Apache warriors poured down from the ridges with supernatural speed and deadly precision. Morrison's men, caught off guard by the ferocity of the attack, scrambled to form defensive positions. Sarah rolled away from the immediate fighting, seeking shelter behind her burning cabin. Through the smoke and dust, she saw Ayanna fighting, his way toward her with desperate determination. Storm responded to his rider's urgency, dancing away from rifle shots and trampling soldiers who tried to block their path. Morrison, seeing his trap collapsing, made a last desperate gambit. He spurred his horse toward Sarah, pistol drawn. "If I can't have the warrior, I'll settle for the traitor who helped him." But Jake the tracker had seen Morrison's intention. The weathered frontiersman threw himself between the captain and Sarah, taking Morrison's bullet in his chest. He fell heavily, blood spreading across his buckskin shirt. "Jake!" Sarah cried, crawling to where he lay. The tracker's eyes were already glazing, but he managed to speak. "Couldn't let him murder a woman," he gasped. "Some things ain't worth living with." Jake died protecting a principle he'd understood in his bones, that some lines should never be crossed, regardless of orders or circumstances. Morrison's face contorted with rage as he realized his authority had completely collapsed. Several of his own men were refusing to fight, horrified by their captain's willingness to murder an unarmed woman. The Apache warriors pressed their advantage, and Morrison pitched backward from his saddle as Ayanna's rifle spoke once. "Are you hurt?" Ayanna asked urgently, sliding down from Storm to check Sarah for injuries. "I'm fine," she managed, though her hands shook as she knelt beside Jake's still form. "But he's dead. He died protecting me." Ayanna's expression grew solemn. "He died with honor. That matters even in war." Around them, the battle was winding down. Morrison's remaining men were either dead, wounded, or fleeing. The entire engagement had lasted less than 10 minutes, but it had changed everything. "The accusations Morrison made about you," Sarah said as Ayanna helped her to her feet. "Were they true?" Ayanna was quiet for a long moment. "3 soldiers came to our village flying a white flag," he said finally. They claimed they wanted to talk peace, but they were scouting our defenses for a dawn attack. When I discovered their true purpose, they tried to silence me permanently. So you defended yourself. I defended my people, Ayanna corrected, as you defended me when you could have let me die. Sarah looked around at the destruction. Her cabin was a smoking ruin, her barn reduced to charred timbers, her garden trampled and burned. Everything James had built was gone. What happens now? She asked quietly. Ayanna studied her face carefully. My people are moving north to Canada where the reach of men like Morrison cannot follow. You could come with us if you choose. The offer was tempting. A chance to start over, to leave behind the hatred and fear. But Sarah knew that path wasn't meant for her. I appreciate the offer, she said. But this is still my home, even if the buildings are gone. I won't be driven away. Ayanna nodded approvingly. You have the heart of a warrior, Sarah McKenna. As the Apache warriors prepared to leave, Ayanna swung back onto Storm's saddle, then paused. Keep the horse, he said. You'll need him to ride to town and tell them what really happened here. What will I tell them about Morrison? The truth, Ayanna said simply, that he died as he lived, consumed by hatred. Let others decide whether that's the legacy they want to follow. As the warriors began filing up the mountain trail, Ayanna turned back one final time. You asked me once why I returned to my people. Now you know the answer. Because sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with weapons, they're fought with choices. You made the right choice, Sarah McKenna, never doubt that. Then he was gone, disappearing into the forest shadows. Sarah stood alone in the ruins of her homestead, but for the first time since James's death, she didn't feel truly alone. She'd discovered something about herself, a strength she hadn't known she possessed, a moral courage that no amount of destruction could touch. The sun was setting behind the mountains as Sarah finally mounted Storm and began the long ride to town. She would tell them about Morrison's descent into murderous obsession, about Jake's heroic sacrifice, about the Apache warriors who could have killed them all but chose restraint instead. Whether anyone would listen remained to be seen. But Sarah McKenna had learned that doing the right thing wasn't about guaranteed outcomes. It was about staying true to your principles even when the whole world seemed arrayed against you. As Storm carried her down the darkening mountain trail, Sarah found herself thinking about Ayanna's words. People of honor have a way of finding each other when they're needed most. She'd helped save a man's life, and in return, he'd helped save her soul. The wind through the pines seemed to whisper James's voice, telling her he was proud of the woman she'd become. Sarah smiled through her tears and urged Storm forward into whatever future awaited her. She'd lost her home, but she'd found something far more valuable, the knowledge that she could face any challenge as long as she remained true to her deepest beliefs. Behind her, the last embers of her old life glowed against the mountain darkness. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also possibility. Sarah McKenna rode toward both with her head held high, carrying with her the memory of a wounded warrior who'd taught her that honor transcends all boundaries of race and culture. In the growing darkness, Storm's steady hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls like a heartbeat, the rhythm of a new life beginning from the ashes of the old.